think I've said this before, when trying to figure out a topic for an exhortation. One of the things I do is look at the daily readings. I think a lot of us do that, looking for words of encouragement, uplifted, that type of thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But thankfully this Sunday it did work. So this is why we're looking at, in Luke, the 7th chapter, Brother Greg read a portion of that for us. And, this 7th chapter, brothers and sisters, really has a lot of inspirational interactions that Jesus had with the Jewish people. That first interaction, we're not going to look at it, but, it could be a whole exhortation, right? Jesus' interaction with the centurion. You have this, Roman warrior known for violence and brutality, humbling himself to Jesus, despite the fact that he had all this power. Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, the Roman centurion said. We have another account, brothers and sisters, of Jesus not being asked, by the way. No one asked him to do this. But just because he saw the weeping and the sadness and the grief of the woman in Nan, he raised up her son. And so we can see the love of Christ. We can see the compassion of Christ for his fellow man. That in every aspect of his life, he did things in service to other people. And so we'll start our exhortation, brothers and sisters. We're going to take a look at a couple events here in the 7th chapter of Luke. Number one, Jesus' words having to do with John the Baptist. What does Jesus say about John the Baptist? How does Jesus help John the Baptist mentally? Because he's in a very difficult situation. And then number two, Jesus' interaction with this unnamed woman as he sat with the Pharisees at dinner. So let's get into it. Verse 19, and John, calling unto him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus with this question: Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? It's a strange question, I think, brothers and sisters, from John the Baptist. He had just said, when Jesus was baptized, he knew he was the Messiah. I'm not worthy to unloose his sandal. But now circumstances had changed. Well, what had changed? John was in prison. He was by himself in prison. He had no real interaction with anybody. And a man that had lived free in the wilderness, going where he wanted, when he wanted, is now in a cage. And so take a moment, brothers and sisters, to think about the psychological aspects of that. John the Baptist in prison. He's at his lowest. To the point where he sends 2 of his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? Or do we look for another? There's frustration in that question. There's doubt in that question. They were related, by the way, brothers and sisters. Remember, they're cousins. John was older than Jesus. But John was the first one to react to Jesus when he was still in the womb of Mary. Remember what he did? The babe leapt in my womb, Elizabeth said. Right? When Jesus came near, still in the womb of Mary. I think it's so powerful. 2 unborn babies coming together in some kind of mysterious way. And John the Baptist, as an unborn baby, leaps in his mother's womb out of joy. But here we have John the Baptist suffering in prison. And when the men were come unto him, they said, John the Baptist, in verse 20, hath sent us, and saying, Art Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? And in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sight. So these disciples here, brothers and sisters, witnessed all of this. They witnessed it for John, to see the Messiah in action. What did he do? Cured their infirmities, their plagues, evil spirits. The blind he gave sight. You imagine being there in the ancient world, and this individual with all these words, these gracious words that he's speaking, but not only that, he's healing people, he's giving blind people sight again. Can you imagine? And this is why his fame went out everywhere. So he does these things in front of John's disciples. Verse 22. Then, so after all of this, he now turns his attention to John's disciples, after he's just healed all of these people. Go your way, he says. Tell John what things you have seen and heard. How that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. To the poor, the gospel is preached. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. It's interesting, brothers and sisters, what Jesus does here. He not only puts it on John's disciples to tell John exactly what they saw, the wonderful miracles, the wonderful words of hope that he is speaking. But he hearkens back to Isaiah, to the prophet Isaiah, to the 61st chapter of Isaiah and in some other locations as well. This idea of the Messiah coming and saving Israel and also the world. And so John knew these. John knew his Bible. He knew the prophets. He knew all about Isaiah. Isaiah actually prophesied of him. That's the only time, by the way, brothers and sisters, where a prophet is prophesied to come outside of Jesus. Okay? And that's why John the Baptist was the greatest. There were prophecies about the great prophet John the Baptist in Isaiah and in Malachi as well. And so John would know these things. And so this was Jesus' way of strengthening John for what was to come. He reminded John. He's actually going back right to the beginning of their ministries when they came together to baptize Jesus. He's going back to that time, making John think about when it all started and the wonderful things that had taken place. So it's just another example of Jesus' love and compassion, particularly for John the Baptist here. Okay? And so, how do we apply that to our lives? I bet everybody in this room has been locked in a cage in some way. Not really, you know what I'm saying? But we've dealt with things that we've felt we've been hemmed in, difficult situations, not knowing how to get out of them. That was John the Baptist. But the one thing that Jesus did was to remind him of the great hope that he had. And he does the same thing with us through the Word. We are reminded of the great hope that we have. And what type of individuals should we be? He continues on now, brothers and sisters, talking about John. He says, when the messengers of John were departed, he began to speak to the multitude. And he said, what did you go into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft raiments? Indeed, those who are gorgeously apparelled and live in luxury are in king's courts. Well, what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, more than a prophet. He asked this question over and over again, brothers and sisters, to the multitude. What did you go out to see? What did you think you were going to find with John? We don't have to turn to it. Remember back, I think in Matthew, they actually sent people out to John, like, who are you? Or are you Elijah? You another prophet? What's the deal with you? And John said perfectly, I'm going before the face of God. I am the messenger to prepare the way, to make straight the crooked paths. Jesus explains that John was a great man of God, one who did not live for his own comfort or the approval of others. John was a chosen prophet of God. He wasn't a man pleaser. In fact, it got him in trouble, didn't it? Right? And eventually got him killed. Jesus quotes from Malachi, the passage about the coming of John, because the prophets themselves were not prophesied. We don't have any examples of a prophet being prophesied about, but John was, and that's why he was the greatest. John was steady, not shaken easily like a reed. John was sober in that he lived a disciplined life, not in love with the luxuries and comforts of this world. John was a servant, a prophet of God. John was sent as the special messenger of God. He was special in that he was considered the greatest prophet in the Old Testament. But Jesus says that John would be second to the least of any individual in the kingdom of God in the new covenant. In verse 29, in verse 28, for I say unto you, among those that are born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist, but he that is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. It's interesting the reaction, brothers and sisters. The people heard them, and they justified God. They're being baptized with the baptism of John. So it's interesting here. We know what types of individuals were baptized by John. They were the publicans and sinners, the people that needed it. They needed baptism. But the leaders of Israel wanted nothing to do with baptism. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves being not baptized of them. The scribes and Pharisees weren't baptized. They didn't believe in it. And so John was baptizing the sinners, the publicans. And that's why they rejoiced here in this account when they heard that John was the greatest prophet. They embraced baptism. And so we see this, again, we see the belligerence, but also kind of the building of this friction between the religious leaders and John the Baptist. We know now how that ended. We also know that it's beginning to build with Jesus as well, the animosity between the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders, and Jesus. It's interesting as well, verse 32, they are like the children sitting in the marketplace. You know, Jesus is talking about how will I liken the men of this generation? It's most likely here, brothers and sisters, when he talks about the children in the marketplace. We have piped unto you, and you have not danced. We have mourned to you, and you have not wept. It is probable that Jesus here alludes to some type of game or a play that the children would put on in order to be paid in the marketplace, some type of silly skit or something like that, right? They looked at John the Baptist and said, there's something wrong with this guy because he doesn't eat and drink. He's out in the wilderness, right? Oh, he's got a devil or a demon. That's what they said about John the Baptist, right? So that's one extreme. You have John the Baptist in the wilderness preaching and baptizing, really kind of outside of civilization, outside of the towns and the cities where Jesus went. So John the Baptist had a demon because he lived that type of lifestyle. But what did they say? Jesus didn't live that type of lifestyle. He was different. He was with the people. He didn't live that crazy life out in the wilderness. But what did they say about Jesus? The Son of Man is come eating and drinking, and ye see, behold, a gluttonous man and a wine-bibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. They had an answer for everything. John the Baptist, demon, don't associate, baptism, crazy. Here comes Jesus. He's associating with people, eating and drinking, having dinners with people, preaching. A drunkard, wine-bibber, glutton. We know these types of people, don't we, brothers and sisters, right? A problem for every solution. This was the scribes and Pharisees. They wanted the narrative. We live in a world which is all about narratives, right? Particularly in presidential races, right? What's the narrative? The scribes and Pharisees had a narrative, right? John the Baptist, demon. Jesus, drunk. Don't listen to him. We got all the answers. And so that was the dynamic. And Jesus points it out. It's like, what are you guys doing? A glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. The title of a friend of a tax collector and sinners, that was in direct contrast to John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist, he didn't have dinners with the publicans and the sinners. He baptized them, but he was out by himself. Not many, people would have said during that time that John the Baptist was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Jesus didn't say that about himself, by the way. He told us what the religious leaders said about him. And for the most part, it was wrong. It wasn't true that John the Baptist had a demon. It wasn't true that Jesus was a glutton and a winebibber. It wasn't true, at least in the sense that they meant it, that Jesus was a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But there was another sense, a glorious sense, in which that last accusation was true. Jesus is a friend of sinners. He was a friend of tax collectors in the sense that he loved them. He wanted them saved. He did not despise them or push them away. He genuinely wanted to help them and rescue them from sin, the shame, the power, and the penalty of sin. Christ came to destroy it. Last part of our exhortation here, brothers and sisters, we're going to take a look at the event where Jesus comes into a Pharisee's house for a dinner. Now, all of the things that precede this dinner we've talked about. Jesus healing everybody. Jesus having these interactions. Raising a man from the dead. Healing a servant of the centurion. Okay, all of these things have happened. And so the Pharisees, and we still haven't gotten to the point, by the way, where the Pharisees couldn't even stand to look at Jesus and were trying to kill him, right? We're at the point here in Luke, the beginning of Luke's account, where they're actually having sit-downs together, having meals together in a Pharisee's home. Jesus, a religious individual, is going into a Pharisee's home. Most likely a pretty nice home where you could have a nice lounge, a meal, right? Now remember, and this is important to set the stage, remember that in the ancient world, particularly in the Middle East, they didn't have chairs and tables to sit at. Okay? They had a table, but it was very low. And you lounged at the table. You lounged at the table. Ate a little bit, maybe put your, just ate, drank a little bit. You're lounging. There would be pillows all around. It was nice. Sounds nice. And so that's kind of the setup here. Okay? Verse 36, and one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Sounds great. Sounds nice. Inviting Jesus in. We're going to have a nice talk. We're going to talk about theological issues, the law, God's love and grace. We're going to hash it all out. And there were other people there, obviously. Okay? So, that's when someone that wasn't invited to the dinner shows up. Okay? Just let's paint the picture. Okay? Paint the picture. Pharisees, very religious Pharisees, okay? Strict adherence to the law, the rituals, the routines of the law. Pharisees knew it. They memorized everything. Just very, very righteous individuals. They knew the law. They were righteous Jews. They were leaders of the people, okay? Probably, they had a brain on their heads, They understood things. Anyways, and behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment. All right, let's just stop there for a second. We're not sure who this woman was. There is another account where Mary of Bethany does this as well, okay? We're not given the name of this individual, of this woman. Her faith, however, brothers and sisters, is on display for the world to see, okay? And there is a lesson in this faith. You know, it was really bold for a woman to come into a meal of Pharisees. That was really bold move by this woman. They weren't allowed to be here, right? It's particularly a woman that had a reputation for sin. Okay? Most likely writers and commenters say she most likely was a prostitute. Okay? And this is why, what do they say, right? Verse 39, now when the Pharisees which had bidden him saw what she was doing, this man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that touches him, for she is a sinner. You know, Jesus, if you were a real prophet, you wouldn't let this unclean, wicked woman touch you. Sounds like you're not a prophet because you're letting this sinner wash your feet. What's wrong with you? Pretty much what they're saying. So what did this woman do? And stood at his feet. Okay, so let's, again, context is important. Visualizing the scene is important. Jesus is lounging, okay? His torso, this is the table, his torso is right here. He's lounging, he's eating. His feet are kind of out like this behind him, okay? His feet would be disgusting. Let's be honest, he would be walking around in sandals and all that dirt and, you know, just the wear and tear, right, of sandals. They'd be very dirty, okay? And so she comes up behind him and begins to wash these dirty feet with her tears, the oil, and with her hair. What an incredible visual that we have here. Okay? But it was a very difficult situation for her. Think about how scared she must have been going into this environment, all men most likely. She's the only woman. She is a woman with a reputation. But she was willing to do anything to express her love for Jesus. She brought a flask, an alabaster flask, okay, and in it had oil. Both the container and the content show that it was an expensive gift brought to honor Jesus. The alabaster flask, it had no handles and was furnished with a long neck, which was broken off when used. The contents, obviously, were very costly. And Jewish ladies commonly wore a perfume flask suspended from a cord around the neck. Okay, little flask, right? And it was a part of them. Their perfume bottles were a part of them. In fact, they were allowed to wear them on the Sabbath day. Okay, so in a strange way, the perfume bottle or the scent of the perfume was an extension of the woman. You understand that? And so that's another context. Like she's giving her whole self, her whole essence to Christ, humiliating herself, washing dirty feet, weeping, to the point where she could wash the feet with her tears. Think about how much tears is involved in that. Think about the emotional upheaval of this woman. Her service to Jesus was personal. She did it all herself and all for him. We notice in this account, brothers and sisters, how many times the pronoun she and her are used. 3 times she is used. Her twice. It emphasizes her action and her action alone. The faith of this woman. She served Christ herself. It wasn't for Peter. It wasn't for James or John or anybody else in that room. It wasn't for the poor or the sick in the city. It was for Christ. She stood at his feet behind him weeping, and she began to wash his feet with her tears. We can imagine that as this woman anointed Jesus' feet with oil, she was overcome with emotion, with tears flowing from her eyes. She washed his feet with her tears, wiped them clean with her hair, and she kissed his feet repeatedly. I can only imagine her awkwardness. You can only imagine everyone silently watching this event take place. And it's Jesus that's going to break this silence, right? And he asked the question in verse 39, in verse 40. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have a question to ask you. And he says, Teacher, say on. Go ahead, ask your question. And he harkens back to Luke 18 as well, where remember the Pharisee and the publican went up to pray. Okay? This has a connection to that. Okay, to that parable. But this, he says there was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50. And he talks about this, right? Someone had an astronomical amount of money owed. The noble or the king is going to forgive both debts, the huge debt and the very small debt. And so Jesus asked the question, tell me, Simon, in this situation, which of them will love him most? And so Simon wasn't a dumb guy. He kind of knew that maybe he just was led into a trap, a logic trap or something by Jesus. And so he answers kind of coyly. He says, I suppose, perhaps, right? Give himself a little leeway. That he to whom he forgave the most. And Jesus said, you're right. You judged rightly. That's correct. Now, here's kind of the culmination of this whole deal. All right? He says to Simon in verse 44, do you see this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman has anointed my feet with ointment. There's a great quote that I'm going to share right now. He's a Christian writer named John Morrison. He wrote, quote, when all the philosophers are dumb and cannot give one word of help or comfort, when learning has no message to inspire or to console the heart, when sympathy hesitates to break the silence, the Lord has something to say. And what he had to say to Simon was, you had obligations to me as a guest at my home, and you did not do anything. You didn't wash my feet. You didn't anoint my oil. You didn't even give me a kiss when I came in. These are all traditional things that were supposed to be done, brothers and sisters. When a stranger or someone came into your home, you were to show them these gracious acts. Simon did none of these things to Jesus. Simon the Pharisee did see the woman, saw everything this woman did. She was a humble sinner seeking forgiveness, pouring out love for Jesus in the presence of everyone, not caring what it looked like. She was a notorious sinner. She had a lot of sins, but so do we, brothers and sisters. And it was the peace of Christ and the love of Christ that forgave him. I entered your house, Simon. You gave me no water for my feet. You gave me nothing, but this woman has poured out her essence, her life, to me. And so, brothers and sisters, before we partake of this bread and wine, let's examine ourselves. Who are we like in this story? Are we like Simon, passing judgment on everybody, not giving anything to Jesus, busy with other things? Or are we like this nameless woman, full of sin but full of love for Christ?